IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. My name is Prateek Waghre, and today I have with me Anupam, Manur, and Rohan, Seth, and we're going to discuss the new e-commerce rules that were put up for comments last week. So, just to give you some background, right? On 21st June, the Ministry of Consumer Affairs invited comments on draft amendments to the Consumer Protection Rules of 2020. Now, these proposed changes included rules which were supposed to address some of the ways in which e-commerce firms have reportedly worked around FTI regulations, updates to the grievance redressal mechanism. Then it included new requirements for labeling, filtering, and sorting products, as well as a host of other changes, including things like fallback liability and restrictions on flash sales. Now, understandably there has been pushback and concerns from e-commerce firms around this, while industry bodies like the Confederation of All India Traders have welcomed them and called on the government not to dilute these rules in any way, right? And this is amid comparisons to these rules with the IT rules, etc. Now, while we tend to think of mainly Amazon and Flipkart in the context of these rules, it's also important to keep in mind that these appear to apply to a much larger set, right? And with that, Rohan, I want to get your take on this, right? For the sake of our listeners, can you give us a broad overview of what these rules are and what they're trying to do?
Sure. Before I do that, can I just say that the fact that you've mentioned that these are being compared to the IT rules really outlines what the gold standard is in this network. But let's talk about what these rules are. So, the, the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution, and the Department of Consumer Affairs under that has come up with these rules, and they're called the Consumer Protection E-commerce Rules of 2020. These rules, I think, as you said, came at the responses to them may be sent by 6th July. So we have around not we like people have around 6 to 7 days by the time this airs to respond to them. Now these rules are fairly broad. I think we'll get into the nuances of them. I'll just talk about what these apply to. It's another scope and applicability section of the rules, and this says, as clause A says, all goods and services bought or sold over digital or electronic networks, including digital products. So this basically applies to everything that's being sold through a network, not a two-sided market, not a multi-sided market, through the broadest possible interpretation of the term network. So I think that's a fairly broad scope of applicability. I think Prateek and I disagree a little bit on whether or not Netflix will fall under these, but I think there's a good case, or at least there's a good debate to be had here on exactly how broad the scope of these are.
Yeah, Rohan, I think that is the correct place to start. It is worrying as to the language that they've used and how broad and vague it is, right? As we were speaking just before the show, does this apply to Amazon and Flipkart? I think that's the easiest. Seems to be the target, but the way they have worded it would mean that it applies to, let's say, Zomato and Swiggy, Uber. It would apply to, I mean, according to me, I don't know where the point of contention between Prateek and you is, but I think it applies to Netflix, Prime Video, and where it starts getting crazy is that I don't see any reason why it would not apply to an individual selling, let's say, handmade jam over the internet, because it's a product which is being sold over a digital or electronic network. So if someone has an WordPress account and basically wants to, has a basic checkout, e-commerce kind of app built into that and want to sell jam over the internet, I think this applies to that, and that would be extremely scary, right?
And I think just not the checkout process, right? Because I don't think the rules say anything about requiring any sort of checkout process. So potentially, even if you're uh, transacting over something like WhatsApp, right? It seems, right, and as Rohan said, if you take the broadest possible interpretation of it, it seems like even that would fall under the scope of these rules as of now.
Correct. So it's not really just the payment process being done online because they've not specified anything about that. But let's say if I send you an image over WhatsApp saying, do you want to buy this, and you buy it, does that come under these set of rules, right? So the problem is with the word. I mean, I know we're probably taking it to an extreme level, but this can be done. I mean, ultimately, when you want to draft rules, it has to have extreme transparency, clarity, so as to not bring about such kind of confusion.
Absolutely. No, I think that remains an area. So, Rohan, before we started, you were also talking to me about potentially other parts of these rules that concerned you.
I think there are a lot of parts of this bill that concern me, but I'll start with one that I actually have been thinking a lot about since last night. And I don't think this is the most important one. I think this is one that can actually do a great amount of harm, and not just for reputations, but like physical harm. What I mean by that,
May I just interrupt for 1 second? If you've been thinking about the draft e-commerce policy all night on a Sunday, then I really think you need to get another hobby. But yeah, please carry on.
I don't. Yeah, my life is fairly centered around the tech space in India, as you can tell by this conversation. And anyway, so basically, the policy here or the draft here requires the details of sellers to be put on the platform. And I know this is not the biggest point of contention because the scope, etc., are so broad. But if I'm a seller on Amazon, and I think a fair amount of people in India are, I am going to be concerned because the information will include a geographic address of headquarters, and if you are a big seller, then of all branches, name and details of the website, email address, and any other information necessary for communication with the seller. Now, I understand why this is a grievance redressal necessity. I completely get it. But on the other hand, surely there are some data protection sort of implications here. And let me just give you a very, very simple example of how this thing might turn out to be very, very ugly. Imagine you are a seller who, at one point of time, sold foot mats with Om on it. Or maybe it was an image of a deity. And you were selling them, you don't sell them any longer. But if your address has been is on Amazon, and people can identify that you are the seller, I think it doesn't take a lot for people to get triggered and reach to your geographic address, and I think that's going to be fairly terrifying. I say that not just because of this particular example, but because things that might not be controversial today can be controversial tomorrow. So a seller who is just trying to make a living can tomorrow get attacked for some random Twitter trend saying ban Chinese products or so on. Right. So I really think this provision of sellers trying to upload their data so that people can find them, I think this is going to have second order effects that we don't fully appreciate yet. And I think this is something we can anticipate, can see coming, and should not really be a part of the actual rules.
Absolutely, Rohan. I mean, we've seen instances of, let's say, factories being burned down or attacked by a mob, etc. I mean, in an entirely different context, of course, but it's not hard to imagine that, yeah, a seller who's selling something which might suddenly go against the common sensibilities of the population could come under attack, and that is not something that you want to facilitate through a set of rules. But that's part A. Part B, it's also that you might have many sellers, as you mentioned, who might not have a corporate office, who might not have a large production house. As we've been saying, there might be sellers, and there are many on Amazon and Flipkart, who are just individuals in their home who've got a hobby and who are monetizing that hobby, right? So you don't want to put give away that home address on Amazon. So I think that's, I mean, again, probably a smaller thing in the larger context of things, but it does matter, and it's probably something that requires our
Yeah, no, but I think that's where the framing this as a consumer protection situation can potentially explain that away, right? In the sense that you're saying, look, this provision is there so that a consumer knows who is selling the product, right? And there has been some conversation over that, right? Whether these should have come from the Ministry of Commerce or whether they should have come from the Ministry of Consumer Protection. I think that itself has been debated to some extent, and I think this particular aspect may just get explained away using that aspect, not to downplay any of the harms that potential higher order effects that both of you have highlighted.
I also think after this, we need a seller protection set of guidelines just to complement these very fine rules.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're looking at a marketplace now, and you have both buyers and sellers, you need seller protection as well. I don't think. I mean, part of all of this. I mean, I know at sometimes it is seller protection, but not really uh, sellers who are selling on Amazon and Flipkart, but these are mainly meant for protecting the offline sellers who are probably getting affected by this. But that's an entirely different take. Um, if you look at so that's part A of the consumer protection, and kind of linked to that is this entire thing about labeling, right? Which is where they've asked sellers to identify the country of origin of your product and so on, and this has been going on for some time. In fact, this is not the first attempt, right? I mean, Rohan and Prateek, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at least this might be the third attempt where they've tried to get Amazon and Flipkart to get their sellers to basically mention the country of origin of the product they're selling. And this, unfortunately, is a product of whatever geopolitical happenings, especially to do with products with China and so on. And so therefore I see this as a logical extension of that, where they've said you have to give the country of origin, you need to do the labeling aspect, and then there's that ridiculous aspect of that you have to suggest a domestic alternative to ensure fair opportunity for domestic goods. All of this is in one way it is protectionist, in one way it is anti-China. It's a whole bunch of these things in a mishmash of rules, right?
Uh, can I just add that I think there is a very strong sentiment, as Anupam mentioned, of labeling and making sure what goods come from India, what goods come from China. To the extent that if you now go on to Zoom clarifies in a dialog box that your call is being routed through data centers in India, right? And it's why, of course, army officers do not use Zoom as a platform to conduct their video conferences and so on. Now, this sort of actually brings me to incentives, and I think is here, so he'll be able to elaborate a lot more on this. But it now depends on how you define origin, right? So if I am, again, let's say I'm assembling a foot mat, and I am doing this in China. Now, is it technically an Indian origin if I just put a stamp here saying made in India? Does this make this foot mat of Indian origin? Or at what point in the supply chain do you determine that this thing actually originated at place X? Because I feel like a lot of that point is now going to be moving to India, and everything before that point will stay in their respective countries. Does that make any sort of sense, Anupam?
Yeah, Rohan, I mean, I think you've just opened up a Pandora's box here, because nearly 40 to 50% of trade disputes between countries is regarding place of origin. And the fact that they've not been able to figure it out in the offline world for as you mentioned, products such as whatever notebooks and pens, I think it's going to be a lot more difficult. Now you're talking about this, right? Think about the complexities involved in, let's say, a movie. How do you define the country of origin? I think, I mean, people think it's easy, but let's say you have an Indian director, but produced by US studio, but using locations, I mean, set entirely in China. Where do you think it, is it originating from? Similarly, for even for goods and services, as you mentioned, I mean, in increasingly, when you're thinking about global value chains, fixing a country of origin is just going to get harder and harder. When you talk about some components, raw materials being used from one country to expertise being used by another country, that's what human resources from another country, plus let's say software dimension being added, which is what happens in India, right? Software being added from another country and so on, and finally marketing or some VC money coming from elsewhere. You could have very complex set of ingredients going into any kind of product, and therefore I think labeling things as to made in X country would be quite difficult to do, and that'll complicate a lot of these aspects.
Yeah, it seems like this has been envisioned for your basically your physical goods, right? A lot of these rules, if you read them, it seems like they've been written primarily with Amazon and Flipkart in mind, but then and not enough thought given to how it applies to the rest of the industry.
Yeah. So now let's take this to the next step, right? Which is the again where the government is trying to force its Swadeshi, Atmanirbharta, Make in India campaign, all of it into some weird e-commerce consumer protection act. I mean, it's a real again weird mishmash of these rules, but that is where they say that you have to offer a domestic alternative, right? It's not that because the domestic alternatives are cheaper, it's not because they're better quality, but just to ensure that there's a fair playing ground for domestic sellers. Now again, first question is why the hell is this in a consumer protection act? But you leave that aside. Even then, otherwise it does not make sense. And given the fact that, let's say, this would apply equally to Make My Trip, and there I'm looking for flight from Bangalore to Zurich, is Make My Trip then obliged to give an Indian alternative to flights? They might be, but it might be a lot more expensive. It might not work out, etc. Right? Similarly, if I'm looking for hotels in Croatia, then does that mean you have to give me an Indian alternative? I mean, some of these things have really not been thought through. And if an idiot like me can poke holes, then it means that there are probably 100 more holes than I'm poking.
Or maybe they have been very well thought through, and this is some kind of a meta exercise for us to get to the right answers that other people have already reached. But can we also talk about the flash sales component of this? Because I think I have been itching to talk about this, not least because so the policy says, the draft says that flash sales are not allowed on platforms. Now, when I first heard about it, I was concerned as to what exactly would make an event a flash sale. So the policy has done this job of saying that you either have significantly reduced prices, you have high discounts, or you have attractive offers for a predetermined amount of time. So I'm not sure who came up with this clause, but I would like to go to them and ask them.
If I can add, right, just
Yes.
because so I think a lot of people asked this question, and I believe there was a clarification that came out from the government, which said that conventional flash sales will be allowed, right? Nobody knows what conventional flash sale is.
Mhm.
And the clarification also said, and this part is in quotes, and I'm deliberately doing that because, yeah, well, you'll see why. Only specific flash sales or back to back sales which limit consumer choice, increase prices, and prevent a level playing field are not allowed. Right? That was the clarification. I am not sure what that means either.
Okay, so let me ask this question then, uh, to whoever came up with this policy. How do you, okay, so if there are two sales coming up, if there is a Flipkart Mega Million Days and an Amazon Diwali sale coming up, now I have my own feelings on how attractive the discounts on these are. I'm sure other people have their own feelings on how attractive the discounts on these things are. What qualifies as an attractive offer for a predetermined amount of time? What qualifies as a significantly reduced price? And what qualifies as a high discount? Is 40% a high discount? Is 20% on an iPhone a high discount? I I don't know how to qualify these and then come to an objective conclusion as to why this should be qualified as a flash sale. And secondly, I also sort of struggle to understand what the problem with these flash sales was in the first place. How exactly are they limiting consumer choice, and why this was necessary?
Yeah, Rohan, I think the wording is so vague and perhaps deliberately so as to give an extremely high amount of discretionary powers to the regulators to go after whoever they please, right? That's a cynical view, and I think for whatever reason it might hold true here. But so the wording aside, which is just as I think we've established, completely ridiculous because there's no way to determine any of those aspects. The wording aside, the main question again is, how is a flash sale anti-consumer? I mean, if it's again coming from a Consumer Protection Act, how is it hurting consumers, right? They say it limits consumers' choice. I'm unable to see how that could even possibly be true. Now, they would probably say, and some of my readings has told me this, that they're saying that, let's say Amazon and Flipkart, that's the focus, right? Let's not forget that. They've worded it very vaguely and broadly, but their focus seems to be on Amazon and Flipkart. So Amazon and Flipkart will select only a few sellers to do these flash sales with, right? So they make an agreement with, let's say, a phone manufacturer, and they get some, I don't know, some cut out of it, and then basically they go ahead and do a flash sale. I think that's where their interpretation of what this flash sale is, and therefore, because you have such agreements between an e-commerce platform and a particular seller, and not with all sellers, I think that's where their area of concern is. I'm not justifying it, by the way. I'm just trying to interpret what they mean.
All right. I think at least in my experience, and I must confess, I'm not a regular shopper at these quote unquote flash sales. But as a consumer, I've never gone there and felt my choice is so extremely limited. How dare they hold a sale? Instead, it's always been like, okay, well, these offers aren't attractive enough. I don't know why this sale exists. This should be better, and then I just leave Amazon.
Yeah,
so
right.
Yeah,
at best, you will not get the product that you're looking for at a reduced price. At that point, any consumer is more than capable of making a choice, saying, do I get a product which is probably my third choice at an extremely reduced price, or do I still buy my first choice at a highly at whatever the normal price, which might be 2x more than the one at price? I think any customer is able to make that choice, right? And so be it. I mean, it's done in completely sound mind, and it's up to them to choose between the two. So this is perhaps the most ridiculous aspect of this rule, right? Now, which means we have to go into the reality of things, right, and take a far more cynical approach. Why is this done? The simple factor, it's conjecture, of course, you can't prove it in the court of law, but this is just pressure from your offline retailers. I mean, it's that's a cynical take, but I think unfortunately also a true take, that your offline retailers are sometimes not able to compete with your online retailers because of these flash sales and other sales that go on. So you want to target that, and therefore you're I don't know. I mean, you've complained to the government. Government is pandering to its voter base, and voila, you see this rule, because there's no other logical explanation which can which can possibly explain this.
So it's trader protection in a seller protection in a consumer protection rule.
This is exactly what I said earlier. I mean, you have seller protection in consumer protection, but it's not the sellers on these platforms, but elsewhere.
So these guidelines are protecting a very, very specific part of a very, very specific landscape that we have identified to be none of us or the sellers or the platform. But at the same time, they're sort of protecting all of us. That's where I'm at.
Yeah, so it's a deeply. I mean, I think that entire flash sale thing will get the most amount of pushback, because it makes no sense, and it in fact it will do a lot of consumer harm, right? Because people look forward to these sales. They get a lot of what you would call as consumer surplus during these periods. If you're getting a product for 50%, 60%, 70% discount of the original price, then that gives a lot of consumer surplus. That also increases disposable income. It's great for everyone involved. And the fact that the government is targeting something like this seems to be bizarre, and that which is why a cynical explanation will come into play.
All right. Can we also talk about the discrimination aspect of this? Because the policy at some point says that e-commerce platforms are not allowed to discriminate between users of the same class. Now, I have some issues with the wording of this. By far, the biggest of which is that it doesn't actually say price discrimination. So I imagine then this also applies to, you can't discriminate in what ads or even what products people see on the platform. So is this sort of telling platforms to stop personalization? So, for example, if I am searching for peanut butter and Anupam is searching for peanut butter, if today we might not get the same results, post the implementation of policy, are we going to all get the same results? I'm not sure what kind of discrimination is being referred to here.
Yeah, I have to feign ignorance on this issue. I mean, I don't know. I think that is too vague to even venture a guess. But let me. So that's one aspect of it. But it could also be in the aspect of sellers, right? Discrimination in terms of sellers. So, for instance, it cannot promote its own product. Again, the standard vertical integration problem, right? So I think they might be referring to discrimination on that angle as well, which there are a couple of clauses on this aspect, right, in that entire e-commerce rules, where they've said that, firstly, they've tried to tackle this vertical integration problem in multiple ways in the past. Again, this might be its third or fourth attempt, once through the FDI rules, others through Company Act. They've also, basically your Amazon and WS Retail kind of problem, right? Or Amazon and Cloudtail, sorry, and Flipkart and WS Retail. So they've done that repeatedly, and now I think they're taking one more shot at it through your Consumer Protection Act. So one part of it is this discrimination angle. So probably they're saying that, if I search for a particular product, then they can't discriminate their own affiliated industry or affiliated companies product over something else, right?
So if, I'm just looking at a specific clause, right, where this was it strangely it does seem to be directed to the consumer specifically, and the subclause over that seems to, at least my impression, seems to target surge pricing, because they're talking about platforms not gaining an unreasonable profit by imposing on consumers any unjustified price having regard to the prevailing market condition, and it goes on and on and on. But that, at least to me, seems like the first part of that clause is going after surge pricing. The second part of it, which, as Rohan pointed out, makes a reference to same class, it seems, I'm not sure under where that comes from and what sparked that.
Yeah. So, I mean, some part of it could be this personalization thing, definitely, for sure. And the second, I mean, broader aspect that I'm also trying to, get at is this entire thing about, again, vertical integration, which they're getting at. I don't know if they've specifically, I've not looked at this clause, but so I don't know if they're targeting it through this clause. But there's another clause, if you guys have seen, about data sharing, right? That an e-commerce platform cannot use the data of its users to and then share it with its own affiliates, right? That's typically the problem that you've seen with with Amazon and its own wholesale and retail producers. So in some sense, I mean, one part of it is probably the customer personalization. Then there's this other big aspect which they're also trying to target, which is on vertical integration. So yeah, there's an interplay between the two.
I have a big image of Jeff Bezos coming in and saying, we do have a policy that permits people, us, from not looking at sellers' data, but I can't promise you it's not been violated, which is
Yeah.
which is excellent to have. Also, on vertical integration, can I add? They have a clause which says that no e-commerce entity shall permit usage of the name or brand associated with that of the marketplace for promotion or offer for sale of goods or services on its platform in a manner so as to suggest that such goods or services are associated with the marketplace. So, what this basically reads to me is that you can't have Amazon Basics on Amazon. And I, do we have do we have a consensus on this, or is there a different interpretation of this?
No, I think that is very clear. So they've done this in more than one way, right? As we've said, I mean, they really do not want Amazon's affiliated companies selling on Amazon. And Amazon also changed its ownership structure sometime back, reduced its holding on Cloudtail, etc. But it doesn't seem to be enough, and therefore that now this is a much more directly worded thing. Two aspects, as you correctly say. One is this thing about having the name associated with it. So I think Amazon Basics is out of the window now. And two is using data, right? So Amazon cannot collect data from its users, from other sellers, etc., and then pass that data on to one of its affiliates. So whether it's Cloudtail or Amazon Basics. So they're very clear on that. And to be honest, okay, this is contrarian view, but I think this is important in terms of the policy, right? Unfortunately, it is mixed up in an otherwise incoherent and messy set of rules, but making rules. And by the way, also the wording of the rules is important. They've just said Amazon will ensure, or Amazon will promise that it will not do this, right? Which is different from a much more direct view, but nonetheless, I think this is an important step because it has caused a lot of problems in the past. And I think that is truly unfair. If Amazon, the marketplace, uses data from the rest of the sellers, to help Amazon, the retailer, Amazon Basics, the retailer. I think that is fundamentally unfair. It's not a level playing field. It is anti-competitive. It violates the neutrality of the platform. So on all of these counts, that particular rule for me stands out and probably is a good thing.
I agree. I think in some part of my conscience, I can see Cloudtail Basics coming up very, very soon, which is, of course, a completely different platform and brand, not associated with Amazon and so on. But I do agree.
Yeah. So let's. I know we're well over time, but let's finally talk about the fallback liability, right? Because you can't, end this conversation without talking about that.
Yeah.
So, just a very brief summary: fallback liability basically means that Amazon, the marketplace, or any of these platforms will be liable for misselling, for fraudulent sales, etc., of any one of its sellers. So it might be because of negligent behavior, or it could be deliberate. So basically, if Rohan as a seller on Amazon sells me a fraud product, then not only is Rohan liable in some kind of consumer protection and consumer code, but also Amazon, the marketplace, should be held liable. That's what these new draft rules say. So, quick takes, Rohan and Prateek.
I think I'd be happy to sell you an econ textbook written by me. I think which would be very well deserved. But I think
Which will be entirely fraudulent. I mean, we know that.
but on a serious note, I think if you've read Brad Stone's book Amazon Unbound, which recently released, it talks about one of the ways in which Amazon got more sellers onto the platform, and the key sort of strategy there is to actually say that they really lowered the barriers on what it means to be a seller on Amazon. So you don't need to go through 100 hoops. Instead, you need to go through two, and which means that you have more products and less checks and less quality checks. And this sort of seems to be targeting that process and saying, listen, if you are a seller on Amazon, there needs to be a certain amount of accountability that's attached to you. How this is going to work out, what the second order effects of this are, I don't think I am equipped enough to answer that question. What I can tell you is that this is the process they're targeting, and I think we're in for interesting times ahead as far as Amazon and Flipkart strategies are concerned.
Yeah, I haven't made my mind up on this either, right? But I think the idea of liability, yes, you can make the case that it's certainly a consumer protection thing. Again, I'll go back to my point of these rules being written primarily for Amazon and Flipkart, but the fact is that this would apply to other smaller, potentially domestic e-commerce marketplaces as well. And that's where my concerns with this with that clause kind of surface, right? In the sense of what impact could it have on them? It's a little hard for me to argue that maybe Amazon and Flipkart would have the wherewithal to do something like this. I don't know how this will work for smaller smaller e-commerce platforms, and what that means in general for the e-commerce marketplace in India. That's the part that I'm trying to get my head or to wrap my head around.
Yeah. Okay. One, the fact that they have applied this across the board is problematic. So, for instance, I think a lot of people would agree that this kind of fallback liability in, let's say, the cab aggregator space would make a lot of sense. Because if, let's say, again, a driver misbehaves with a customer in an Uber cab, a lot of us would agree that Uber should in some way be held responsible, right? For whether they're onboarding the cab driver, whether not having enough safety protocols, etc. So some part of that I think holds true. Why, I don't know. Again, it's a philosophical question, but when it comes to safety of passengers, then you say that Uber should be held responsible. At least that's what the predominant narrative is. We can debate that in another kind of episode, whether that should be the case or not. But when it comes to a marketplace, strictly a marketplace of buyers and sellers of goods and services on a two-sided market, then I fail to see how Amazon and Flipkart should be held responsible for products. Now, one thing I think Amazon and Flipkart, I mean, such marketplaces should be doing is to check, one, whether they're real sellers, check basic documentation, so KYC, etc., should be done. There's no two words about these things, so ensure that that is a real person, right? Because once you ensure that there's a basic address proof that Amazon does, need not be published. But once you ensure that there is these things which ensure that the seller is real, and then let them sell, and then you have a complex system of ratings, reviewers. Even if the product is wrong or this thing, there's you can send it back for refund. There's returns. There's all of these mechanisms in place to help the consumer. And in fact, it is in the interest of Amazon and Flipkart, the marketplace, and by and large interest of any of the sellers as well, to ensure that there is consumer protection, because they want to get more customers and this thing, because there's this rating and review system, right? So I think all of these things matter, and they're already in place. So and beyond all of that, there is the existing consumer code. So let's say you sold a fraudulent product, you can still move the code. There is a consumer code for all of this, right? So you don't need to hold Amazon liable for it. You can hold the seller directly liable, which is why the Amazon has to just make sure that the seller is real entity, and what they're selling, it's I think Amazon also has to check what category of goods they're selling, and so on. But beyond that, I think that's where Amazon's liability should end. They can't be held responsible if, let's say, some electronic shop sends me a bad product, right? Then you should be able to take it up. So Amazon should have in place where they can help you with even if you have to move the consumer code, help you with those things. You can draw many parallels to this, right? In the offline world, for example, there are in Delhi or in Bangalore, etc., there is a government built shopping complex, for instance, where there are many different shops. Can you hold the shopping complex responsible for the items sold in particular shops? I don't think you can. Similarly, in malls, mall is essentially a marketplace for different shops, for buyers and sellers to interact. Can you hold Garuda Mall responsible for what's being sold inside? Again, if it is not illegal, then you can't, right? So I think that is a highly controversial move. I don't think I quite support it, unless you get the wording right, because before you know it, you can start, if I get a if I get jeans I ordered which is one size larger than what I did, then if I start blaming Amazon for it, I think there's no end to it, right? Then it's probably the end of e-commerce marketplaces as we know it.
No, yeah, I think that's a good point, right? So very quickly, let's just move on, right? We've covered a lot of ground, but any, I guess, parting thoughts, final thoughts on these rules before we wrap up? Main takeaways.
Yeah, just one or two. I mean, probably just one. I'll limit myself to one, which is to say that, see, these draft rules are probably, I mean, if I was the government or any part of the government, then I would deliberately put out certain outrageous bits in it, such that they become the center of attraction, and then I'd be willing to forego those things in order to come to a more compromised rule set, but I'll still be able to get the core of what I want. Some part of me tells me that this is such a play. You deliberately put in some outrageous bit so that the more gentle bits get passed without too much fight back.
I think we'd be not so pleasantly surprised if they don't forego anything, Anupam. They just go ahead with all of it.
Definitely.
I think when these came out, I was on a call with Prateek and I shared an analogy that I'll share here. See, a few years ago when I was working at Niti Aayog, if you've been to the building, it's quite iconic. It's the old Planning Commission building. You go to the third floor, fourth floor, or second floor, whatever. All these floors have taps, right? They have taps on the corridors, and these are huge sort of places where you can wash your hands. So on top of each of these taps is written, "Don't wash your utensils here." And as a newcomer, I am thoroughly puzzled as to how many people were washing their utensils, so that these bold letters had to be put here. Now, I was perplexed until the time my research officer said to me, "Listen, we just had lunch, so just wash your plate." So I went up and I was going to the washroom to wash it, and I realized that there's a tap right next to me. So I start washing the plate over there, and I look up and this letters shouting at me saying, "Don't wash your utensils here." My broad point here is that I don't understand why a lot of this policy has been put in place the way it has. Maybe I am being naive. But I don't know why stuff from competition law has a place here. I don't understand why the seller protection stuff has been put in here in the way that it has. Now, is it because of best case scenario? I think because it's because the government has data that has led to these actions being taken. Worst case scenario is that we don't know what we are doing, and this is going to have second order effects that sort of rack up the whole landscape and actually damage growth in a promising area. Right. Of course, I cover all of this in my newsletter, which is available. I think we can add a link to the show notes. But I think those are my final thoughts.
So thanks, Rohan, for another elaborate, irrelevant analogy just to talk about yourself. Yeah, we're used to it now by now. So with that, I think we can wrap up.
Yeah. On that note, and that image of Rohan washing utensils, thanks for joining us.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is at IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week. Thank you so much to Cred, Seth, and Global Victoria. Without you guys, this thing would not be possible. So, on the note, Maruk Inayat gives us an overview of the potential Twitter ban in India. On this round is on me. Gauri Devi Dayal was joined by actor-producer Purna Jagannathan to talk about her career in Bollywood, Hollywood, and theatre. She talks about the upcoming season of the show Never Have I Ever. On Cyrus Says, we had legendary musician Usha Uttup. She took us through her journey and shared her experiences as the unconventional musician. In the second installment of the Father's Day special on Akla Station Adulthood, Ayushi has a candid conversation with her father, Siddharth Amin. On the Global Victoria Tech Talks podcast, we showcase some compelling new tech stories coming out of Melbourne. Whether it's from the buzzing gaming industry or the robust edtech sector, Victoria is increasingly becoming a hub of emerging technology. And we talk to some thought leaders and industry legends about the same. Catch all the action from the World Test Championship on the Edges and Sledges podcast. For our Hindi listeners, we have Khel Niti, which goes live on YouTube every morning. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
From uncensored and unfiltered chats with the who's who of the entertainment industry, I, Siddharth Kannan, bring your very heartcake chat show called Candid Kannan. Tune in every Friday on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.